Welcome to Restoring the Mind, where we discuss the mind and brain and all its domains. My name is Khalid Mahmood. Today's topic is why the Middle Eastern countries are bleeding. My guest this week is Sami Hamdi, the Managing Director of International Interest, a global risk and intelligence company. He advises governments on the geopolitical dynamics of Europe and the Middle Eastern North African region, and has significant expertise in advising companies on commercial issues related to volatile political environments and their implication on market entry, market expansion, and managing of stakeholders. Sami is also featured as a commentator for Aljazeera, Arabic and English, Sky News, BBC, TRT World, and other outlets. Can you just update the listeners on how did Lebanon get to where it is and where did it start from?
I think Lebanon is the victim of big power competition and also of the subsequent division of society on the basis of sectarianism following the civil war and following the Taif agreement that was brokered in Taif in Saudi Arabia. I think that when we look at the situation in Lebanon, the reality is that we have a tripartite government or a tripartite political system whereby you have an Iran-backed Shia group, which is Hezbollah, which is armed with its own militia. You have the Maronite Christians, who tend to lean more on Paris or more on France. And you have Saad al-Hariri, who represents the Sunni bloc very loosely, who is supported by Saudi Arabia. And given Lebanon's geostrategic position on the Mediterranean, each of these powers is wrestling with one another in order to be able to push through their own agenda or in order to use Lebanon as sort of a part of their wider geopolitical ambitions. In practical terms, what it means is every time that a government is being discussed or negotiated, it means that there are often disagreements over the quota. So Hezbollah wants the finance ministry, Saad al-Hariri wants the defense ministry for his ally, the president wants his allies to have some of the key sovereign positions, and the constitution requires that the president be Christian, the prime minister be Sunni, and the speaker of parliament be Shi'i, which means that in all situations, each of these groups has leverage essentially to block the other, and the absence of any political consensus means that what you have is a gridlock. You have a situation in which unless one of them budges, which looks increasingly unlikely, there is no government that is able to be formed. And what compounds the situation is that in this gridlock, each of the three parties is benefiting in their own way, but at the expense of the Lebanese people. So, for example, Hezbollah essentially runs its own de facto state in southern Lebanon with the support of Iran. It has its own supermarkets that it provides to its supporters. It has its own hospitals and the like. You have the Maronite Christians who enjoy their individual communities who are also supported by France. And you have the Sunni populations who, while perhaps they form the majority and while perhaps they are supported somewhat by Saudi Arabia, the leadership, i.e. Saad al-Hariri and the like, are often very wealthy individuals who who are not necessarily personally affected by the troubles in Lebanon. So each of the three parties is sort of content in their own bubble, and which compounds this difficulty in trying to find some sort of political consensus. So when you have a government that doesn't work, when you have increasing debt, when you have now a government in which it doesn't function, it's unable to provide the basic necessities, you have the situation that you have in Lebanon, which is the currency spiraling into value, into having no value whatsoever. You have lack of medicines. You have the blowing up of the Beirut port, which is used, of course, to smuggle weapons by some of the militias involved. You have assassinations of journalists, as we saw late last year and also earlier this year. So with Lebanon now, it's essentially a gridlock situation between these three powers. The president and the Hezbollah want to rule through the majority of the government on their own. Saad al-Hariri doesn't want, or the Saudis don't want the Iranians to exert that sort of control. And so it's sort of either I play or I destroy everything. So now you have this awkward situation whereby nobody is essentially encouraged to form a government of the political parties, and the Lebanese pay the heaviest price.
So the people don't see a way out anytime soon.
I don't think first of all, there needs to be a government, and I think the international community shares a lot of the blame in that it sees Lebanon as part of this wider geopolitical struggle as opposed to a country in its own right. The US, when it talks about supporting Lebanon, is very wary that if it sends money to Lebanon, it might fall in the hands of Hezbollah, who is an Iranian ally. Equally, Iran is very keen to ensure that any support that it gives to Lebanon only reaches Hezbollah and only supports the Hezbollah base in order to ensure that Hassan Nasrallah remains popular. The Saudis have essentially started to roll back their support for Lebanon because they've been increasingly frustrated that after decades of sending money to Lebanon, their allies have only become weaker and their enemies have become stronger. So the reality is that because the international community only looks at Lebanon through the regional geopolitical lens, as opposed to the rights of the Lebanese people to have their own self-determination, you have this awkward situation whereby nobody is willing to put up the money or the funds that are necessary because they know it won't go directly to the Lebanese people. And the Lebanese people who have protested have no clear alternative. I mean, you have to remember that thousands took to the streets against this government. But those thousands could not produce an alternative political front. They could not unite into an effective political front that could upend the whole political system. So the protest brought down Hariri's government, and then 3 prime ministers later, Al-Hariri is back as a prime minister designate because the protests, which were perhaps fearful, perhaps of becoming politicized, did not agree on a leadership and did not allow anybody to take leadership of these protests so as to channel it into something that could actually change the situation for them. And this is why now you have this very awkward situation in that the Lebanese, they say that we protest and we went out in our thousands, nothing changed. So what are we expected to do now? And this is why you have this sort of despair unfolding before us in Lebanon.
Yeah, I was thinking that the whole region in one way or the other is in a almost similar situation to somewhat. And if I kind of turn to Egypt a little bit, and what they have been kind of having meeting after meeting with the Ethiopians about the dam and everything like that, and at the same time, nothing has happened. Well, obviously, no conclusive agreement has been made. But now, with the hyperinflation in Egypt, and the government is kind of cutting the subsidy for the bread and etc. And now the COVID has brought its own little gift for the Egyptians of 1 million loss in revenue per day because the UK has put Egypt on a red list. Okay, so where is does Egypt actually go? What options does CC have, and what does CC do you think would be thinking about? What solutions can you provide to the people about the dam? Because the water will start to decrease soon, and it will kind of start to have impact on the people.
I think it's important to remember that Sisi rules with an iron fist in Egypt. So when the editor-in-chief of the Ahram newspaper, which is the biggest newspaper in Egypt, when he wrote an article criticizing Sisi's handling of the Renaissance Dam issue of the Ethiopian dam, he was essentially imprisoned, and now he's being put on trial for terrorism. When Hassan Naf'a, who is a prominent academic who supported Sisi's coup on the democratically elected Mohammed Morsi, when Hassan Naf'a criticized Sisi in a tweet over his economic policy, Hassan Naf'a was essentially castigated to the extent to which he announced on Twitter that he would not engage in these issues once more because the Egyptian environment doesn't allow it. And the reality is that when we're looking at the way that Sisi operates, it's important to remember first and foremost, before we look at the Renaissance Dam or even the economy, that Sisi's primary remedy is repression first and foremost, before it's about applying any sort of economic reforms or economic development or prosperity for Egypt. It's about cementing the army control over Egypt after it was threatened by the Arab Spring, after it was threatened by the Egyptians who took to the streets and who dared to dream one day that they could actually decide who would rule them. And that's why I think we still see that the Sisi regime is exceptionally sensitive to all opposition. Abdel Munim Abdel Futuh, a former presidential candidate, was arrested in 2018, and now he's being charged for terrorism charges and the like. and we continue to see an ever greater crackdown on opposition. When it comes to the Renaissance Dam in and of itself, the reality is that Egypt is paying the price of having turned its back to Africa for decades. The reality is that Egypt does not find sufficient support from the states of the African Union, who believe that Egypt has displayed significant arrogance in the affairs of African politics, which is why Egypt tried to get the Security Council to decide on the issue. But the Security Council, which Ethiopia has good relations with some of their members, but also Ethiopia is essentially in a spat, of course, with Washington as well. But the Security Council essentially said it's not an issue for them and that it's an issue for the African Union. So the Egypt, which had placed its hopes on Washington, where it had placed its hopes on Donald Trump, who once threatened the Ethiopians by saying that the Egyptians will blow up the dam if they don't listen to his deal. The reality is that it's now back with the African Union, and Egypt now finds itself isolated. And the reality is that Egypt's chaos has been to Ethiopia's benefit, in that the lack of any Egyptian cohesion with regards to foreign policy as a result of the Arab Spring and as a result of the subsequent coup and as a result of the domestic turmoil has meant that Ethiopia has been able to build this dam and establish a status quo, or a de facto status quo, that cannot be reversed except by force. But there is also another dynamic to the Renaissance Dam, which is that it's not just that it will provide incredible amounts of electricity for Ethiopia. It's also about power. It's this idea that Ethiopia believes itself entitled to be the major power of East Africa, and that it's time to shake off this status quo in the region in which Egypt has been the dominant power in the region. There is this sense amongst Ethiopians that the Renaissance Dam represents more than just Abiy Ahmed's political ambitions, that it represents Ethiopian sovereignty in East Africa. And that's what's really problematic for Egypt, in that while nations of the African Union may find Ethiopia frustrating, may find Abiy Ahmed annoying, they also find the Egyptians equivalently annoying. And that's why I think Egypt has found it very difficult to find allies. In terms of the economy in Egypt, the reality is that while Sisi has used the army to save on expenses, save on government expenses, because the army is cheaper to use to build infrastructure projects and the like, the reality is that Egypt is still heavily in debt, and the IMF are not making concessions. And in order to pay off that debt, Sisi is being asked to lift subsidies on basic necessities, these subsidies that were imposed in order to ensure that the Egyptians essentially abide by army rule and sort of respect this social contract whereby Sisi says, I feed you, I clothe you, and you be quiet as a result, and you leave all the governing to me. And I think that now when it comes to lifting the subsidies on bread, I don't think it's a decision Sisi has taken lightly. It's a decision he's going to be especially concerned about. It's unclear how the Egyptians will respond, because while it's true perhaps that populations don't take to the streets for the sake of grand principles, they most certainly take to the streets when they're feeling hungry or when there's a burning hole in their pockets. Therefore, I don't think that Egyptians will necessarily take to the streets, but the Sisi regime is clearly still worried, even though I think it's in its strongest position than it's ever been. It's still worried, it's still deeply concerned, it's still worried that nothing is necessarily improving in the manner that it would like. But Sisi relies on repression, and the Egyptian security apparatus is heavily experienced in repressing the population of more than 100 million Egyptians.
Okay. What would you say about the neighbors, the Libyans? Where do they stand now, and what is Haftar doing, and what are the major powers like Russia is there, Turkey is there, the others are there. So who's doing what, and where does Libya stand?
There is a famous Iraqi intellectual who said when NATO intervened in Libya that the Libyans, by bringing in NATO to Libya, are selling their country for freedom. And freedom here be meaning the absolute freedom in that they can do as they like. They can carry guns. There will be militias roaming around. They will be able to say what they want. Militias will be able to kidnap. They will be able to kill. There will be no order. There will be no state. It will essentially be a free-for-all. And the reality is that when we look at Libya, it's important to establish the premise on which everything unfolded, in that I argue personally, and it might be a controversial opinion, that while Tunisia was an organic Arab Spring, while Egypt was overwhelmingly organic, but it was also it also came about at a time in which the army and Mubarak were arguing with each other over succession. Mubarak wanted his son to take power, and so the Egyptian army was happy to go along with the protest. When it comes to Libya, I think the reality is that the Qataris, whose allies were the prime beneficiaries of the Arab Spring, i.e. the Muslim Brotherhood, they essentially got very excited with what was unfolding, and therefore they lobbied heavily for NATO intervention in Libya in order to remove Muammar al-Gaddafi, who ironically was their long-time ally from before, in order to deliver their allies to power. They knew their allies would come to power, and you remember that Qatar set up the contact group in Doha, and it was lobbying Paris, it was lobbying the US in order to recognize NATO intervention, and the Emir Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani came out and said, we considered our wajib shar'i, we considered our religious obligation to bring NATO to get rid of Gaddafi after Gaddafi was attacking the Libyan population. The reason why I mention this is because if you accept that Gaddafi was removed by NATO, I'm not saying that Libyans didn't revolt against Gaddafi. I'm not saying that the Libyans didn't have legitimate grievances. They did. They revolted against Gaddafi, and they struggled against Gaddafi. But when NATO removes Gaddafi, NATO sets the terms and NATO sets the environment. In other words, you have no party that is overwhelmingly in control. What you have is proxies. You have people who now go to NATO allies, seek alliances so that those NATO allies can make them supreme. So you had militias that allied with France, militias allied with Qatar, militias allied with the UK, militias allied with the US. The UK, of course, pulled out very soon after Gaddafi fell. And as a result, you had a deeply unpopular government. You had Libyans who began to essentially reject the political elite, so much so that when it got to 2014, which was supposed to be the elections for a new parliament, those who were in parliament knew that they would be defeated at the elections and tried to resist it and unilaterally extend their term in power. And then, of course, you had Haftar, of course, starting to march in the east with his own militia. When the elections took place, the parliament lost. In this case, the Islamist dominant parliament lost. The Islamists decided to surround the Supreme Court. They used force to seize the airport. They kicked out the newly elected parliament. And Haftar essentially found his sort of umbrella of legitimacy by taking in the ousted parliament and saying, I will be your army, I will be the one who asserts the legitimacy of the elections, not because Haftar is interested in elections, but because Haftar is interested in ruling for himself. So the issue with Libya is that it's very difficult to pinpoint who is right and who is wrong. It's not one of those issues where you're looking at good versus evil. You're looking at a fitna that is a civil war in the full meaning of the word. In other words, even if you're looking at Haftar, and Haftar is, of course, a very negative influence on Libya. Haftar wants to establish a dictatorship. He believes that if he takes power by force, the international community will recognize him, just as they recognize Sisi's coup. The reality is, on the other side, you have a group of militias who don't even recognize the internationally recognized government. And for those who follow Libya, the example of this would be that when the United Nations brokered an agreement for an internationally recognized government in Tripoli under the leadership of a man called Fayez Sarraj, when Fayez Sarraj was trying to enter Tripoli, the militias in Tripoli, not Haftar, the militias in Tripoli themselves tried to prevent Sarraj from entering. They didn't want to be under this government. And Sarraj had to disembark outside of Tripoli and come into Tripoli behind the backs of the militias under the depths of the night. And he turned up in the office and the militia said, oh my goodness, how did Sarraj get into Tripoli? But my point here is this: the only time the militias in Tripoli have been united is when Haftar was at the door of Tripoli. But aside from that, they've taken every opportunity to undermine the internationally recognized government. So if you're looking at Libya from this perspective of East and West, or international authority versus Haftar, the reality paints a very different picture, in that none of the militias respect the authority, none of the militias want elections, none of the militias are interested in a democratic transition. Libya is a free-for-all whereby, just as Haftar tried to establish himself by military force, the militias of Misrata, of Zintan, and in all these other places, they dream of doing the same thing. And this is why Libya, with its uniquely tribal system, we're seeing the effects of that. This is a very tribal conflict. It's a very tribal fitna. And now we're in a state of Libya whereby when Turkey intervened to rescue the internationally recognized government, and it only intervened because it was worried that Haftar would take over Tripoli, and therefore, if you look at the map, you will see that all of the countries of the Mediterranean would subsequently be anti-Turkey and would be able to essentially form a chokehold on Turkish maritime interests. I don't think Turkey went in out of any brotherly sentiment. But when Turkey went in and prevented Haftar from securing a military victory, and when Egypt and Russia threatened to intervene to prevent Turkey from delivering its allies to a military victory, when all the militias realized that the military solution was no longer possible, that's when they started talking. It was international intervention that forced them to talk, international intervention that forced them to agree to elections, and it's international force that's forcing them so far to abide by the transition towards the elections. But the reality is, if you take out that international intervention, they go back to fighting and they go back to war. So now when you look at the international elements involved, you see Turkey, which wants to establish its military bases in the Mediterranean to prevent any possible maritime chokehold. You see the Russians, who are very happy now that they have another military base that's overlooking the Mediterranean, that's added to the military base in Syria. They believe the Americans have encroached on them for too long, and this is part of a counterattack against them. You have Egypt, which doesn't want to see the Islamist rule and might agree to a partition of Libya between East and West. And you have the UAE, which absolutely wants to destroy any scent of the Arab Spring, and it's also willing to support a partition between East and West. We have now a Libyan political dialogue forum, which is now in chaos as the parties debate whether elections should be delayed or the rules for who should be able to run in elections. It's becoming clear that they don't want elections. And now we're in this very awkward stage whereby even if Libya has elections, just as in 2014 they had elections, the problem is not in the elections itself. The problem is, what is the guarantee that the parties will accept the results of those elections, or whether they will do as the parties did in 2014, reject the election results, seize the airport, plunge the country into civil war because they're the ones who did not win. That's the awkward situation. That's why I think that Libya today, in very similar fashion, Libyans have no agency. Its future is being decided by international powers and by the barrel of a gun, and it looks more likely that we're heading to war than a political settlement.
Sorry. No, let's move to Turkey. And there's a perception about Turkey that its 100-year obligation will be expiring soon in 2023. And Turkey is still in a NATO member, but at the same time is playing a bigger role in regional geopolitics. What do you predict? What's your prediction that what will happen after 2023?
I think Turkey is keen to ensure that it has good relations with Europe and good relations with the United States. I think Erdogan now is suffering from an economic situation. I think we're seeing now that he's changing his language and changing a lot of his foreign policy. We saw Tahnoun bin Zayed, who is a very powerful individual in the UAE, make a surprise visit to Ankara, and Erdogan respond by saying that the UAE is going to invest in Turkey. And that he's preparing to meet Mohammed bin Zayed. We're seeing Turkey stop the Egyptian opposition from criticizing Sisi in Istanbul as he pursues reconciliation with the Sisi. We've seen suggestions that Turkey has offered drones to Saudi Arabia in a bid to also reconcile with Saudi Arabia. It's clear that Erdogan believes he's in a very difficult situation. It's clear he believes it's clear that Erdogan believes that he's facing an existential crisis in terms of the elections that are coming. He's not sure he will win. Turks are very upset about the local economic situation. And this is why I think that for Erdogan, he believes that a lot of the blame is not on his economic policies, which it likely is because of his economic policies, but primarily because of the international pressure from Trump before Biden and the continued international pressure from Biden and the EU. And this is why I think that we're seeing now the shift from Erdogan in that he's less ideological now in his foreign policy and far more pragmatic. And it appears that Erdogan now is trying to make amends. He's He's reconciling with the France also, with which he's had very difficult problems with. He's trying to wind down some of the conflicts in the region, trying to wind down some of his disagreements with other allies, in a bid, of course, to ensure that whatever happens, he will essentially be able to continue with this agreement that expires in 2023.
Okay. Regarding Afghanistan, I mean, in the past, when Morsi came to power in Egypt, the Arab regimes were very much against it, and they pursued a policy of toppling him, which they managed to do successfully. What kind of relationship would the Arabs have with Afghanistan, and how do you see the near future of Afghanistan?
I think the Afghanistan, if from the Arab regime's perspective, was viewed from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy. So I think, for example, Saudi Arabia, after the Soviets were kicked out of Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia sort of tried to wipe its hands clean of Afghanistan. It was worried about the pressure that Osama bin Laden and the Mujahideen were bringing as a result of U.S. pressure. Even during the Clinton administration, there was pressure on Saudi Arabia to get them to rein in the Mujahideen and bring them under control so that they don't pose a threat to the Americans. And the reason Saudi Arabia was under pressure was because it was believed that the mashayikh or the shuyukh or the clerics of Saudi Arabia had the greatest influence on the ideology of these Mujahideen. So the point I'm making here is that for Saudi Arabia, Afghanistan was viewed through the lens of American foreign policy. So when the Americans went in, Saudi Arabia was ready to support it, UAE supported it, Turkey supported it, the other Arab nations, Qatar supported it and the like, and they all went for whatever the US wanted in Afghanistan. In terms of what we're seeing unfolding before us, the reality is that nobody predicted that the Taliban would be able to take Kabul with the speed that it actually took Kabul. And so you have this awkward situation whereby they're all scrambling in order to re-establish their ties with the Taliban and hope that the Taliban will not harbor ill feeling for the role that many of these Arab regimes played in the invasion of Afghanistan. And I think perhaps the UAE realizes that its chances of good relations with the Taliban are slim, and that's why it was happy to take in Ashraf Ghani into the UAE. Saudi Arabia is making tentative statements. But it's important also to stress that Afghanistan is still being seen through the American lens with regards to the Arabs. And by that, I mean that Qatar, for example, which is a country that invested in the Taliban, which secured the Taliban office in Doha, even though the UAE before tried to also get a Taliban office in Abu Dhabi. But even the Doha, which has good ties with Qatar, the reality is that if the US does not recognize the Taliban government, it's unlikely that Qatar, which is a friend of the Taliban, will recognize the Taliban government. Qatar is still viewing Afghanistan through the US lens. Qatar is mediating, but mediating at the US request. And this is why I think that when we're looking at what's taking place in Afghanistan, many of the Arab regimes, it's a wait and see. It's about seeing to what extent the Taliban will be recognized internationally by the Americans, to what extent they'll be recognized by the Europeans, and no Arab state will recognize the Taliban before they're clear that there will not be repercussions from the US for doing so, because there is also a possibility that the US might impose sanctions on the Taliban regime. So in terms of Afghanistan, it's still a wait and see policy over what will happen, and I think that's probably the reason why the loudest countries in recognizing the Taliban are China and Russia, and the Arab nations are sort of sitting on the fence waiting to see what happens.
Okay. Do you see the Yemen war winding down anytime soon?
I think
there has been hints from the Saudis that they do want to wind it down.
I don't think the issue is with Saudi Arabia. I think that any objective analysis of Yemen will point to the fact that when Ali Abdullah Saleh fell, there was a national dialogue. Everybody participated in the national dialogue. Saudi Arabia did not impede this national dialogue, and the Houthis agreed to it, and they formed the government. And the agreement was that at the end of the term of this government, there would be elections. 6 months before elections, the Houthis decide that they want to use force, and they ally with the former president, and they topple the government. I don't think any of that has to do with Saudi Arabia. And I think the reality is that if we look at it objectively, even when the Houthis took Sana'a, and even when they marched towards the southern territories, when they entered Lahj and Ta'iz and the Dhali', and they got to the gates of Aden, Saudi Arabia didn't intervene. And the reality is that even the US were prepared to recognize this military coup on the part of the Houthis when John Kerry suggested that the Houthis could be a viable ally in the fight against terrorism. So I think that when we look at the Saudi involvement in Yemen, for all of the destruction that it's brought, and I don't think that Saudi is a well-intentioned party, but we must say the truth, which is that but for Saudi Arabia, the Houthis would have taken over Yemen and the military coup would have succeeded. The reality is that the internationally recognized government, the government that was agreed upon by a national dialogue of all of Yemenis parties, including the Houthis, is still standing today because of Saudi Arabia's support. So if we look at Yemen through Yemeni lens as opposed to anti-Saudi lens, the reality is that we find a very different picture about what is necessary to end the war. Because the reality is that Saudi has been offering a ceasefire for 2 years. Bin Salman wants to get out of this war. Bin Salman is tired of the rockets that are being fired into Saudi Arabia. But it's the Houthis who don't want to talk. It's the Houthis who believe in the divine right of Ahl al-Bayt, the divine right of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to rule Yemen, and they believe that any other system, it is impermissible for them to agree to. And this is why we see that this is the seventh war that they have launched to establish themselves as leaders of Yemen. So when the Saudis are saying let's talk, the Houthis don't hear the message of let's talk. They hear that Saudi Arabia is on the ropes. We're the ones who are winning. We've taken over Sana'a. We've taken over Hudaydah. We've achieved more success in this seventh war than in any previous war that we've fought. And now there is the choice before the Houthis, is either we take Ma'rib and secure its resources, which means that in any negotiations we can secure autonomy and we can survive without southern Yemen, and therefore we can establish a North Yemen where we rule. Because if the Houthis go to negotiations before they take Ma'rib, they will be obliged to make deals with the Southern Transitional Council or the Southern Separatists in order to survive as a state, in order to survive as an autonomous region. So for the Houthis, the reason they're rejecting the talks when everybody else is ready for talks is because the Houthis believe that if they go to the table now, they won't secure exactly what they're looking for. And this is why when we're talking about the issue in Yemen, what will end the war is either a definitive defeat of the Houthis' bid to take Ma'rib, or the Houthis take Ma'rib and Biden says, okay, they can have it, let's discuss a peace settlement. So Yemen, the reality is that peace is in the hands of the Houthis, who aren't yet ready for peace. They are very emboldened and very encouraged by their military success. They're encouraged by the international pressure on Saudi Arabia. They're encouraged that everybody is looking at Yemen through an anti-Saudi lens as opposed to a Yemeni lens. They are encouraged that Yemeni voices in Yemen are saying that it's the Houthis who launched the military coup, and that these Yemeni voices are being ignored in the general discourse, and that the Yemeni discourse in the international community is focused on Saudi Arabia and not on Yemen's unique and very complex dynamics. The Houthis believe that everything is in their favor. There's no reason to talk. Throw everything at Ma'rib and let's take the city. That's what's preventing peace talks, and Biden doesn't want to intervene. Biden is perplexed that because that the Houthis don't want to talk, despite the fact that he's put pressure on Saudi Arabia and he's threatened Saudi Arabia over the war in Yemen. Biden now is giving into realism, and he's allowed Saudi Arabia now to exert force to prevent the Houthis from taking Ma'rib, while the Americans tried to come up with a new plan to convince the Houthis to come to the table. The Americans have gone to the Iranians to try to convince them to help them to get the Houthis to the table, but the Iranians believe that Yemen is a power card to play in the wider nuclear deal negotiations. So until there's a new deal on the with regards to Iran's nuclear capabilities, Iran will ensure that the Houthis continue to be a pressure card. And I think that the most likely end to the Yemen war will come when Biden and Iran agree on a new nuclear deal, and the Iranians say to the Houthis, enough is enough. We're no longer going to support you in this war. Go to the table and talk.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you very, very much, Sami. And that was very, very educational, very, very knowledgeable. I'm sure my listeners will be very, very grateful for all the information that you have provided. And I will put up the links to your website, and I'll most likely take a picture from your Facebook page and put it there as well. Include that in with the interview. Is that okay?
Much appreciated.
Is there anything else you would like to add?
I think we've covered a lot.
We've covered a lot. Yes. Thank you very, very much.